1975 at the Smithsonian, under the sponsorship of various groups, including the Anthropological Society of Washington, D.C., I was invited for a discussion with Margaret Mead on anthropology and its future. And I began the discussion, and she responded. I first paid my tribute to what anthropology, the minimal amount that I took at Princeton, did to the way I looked at things. And I derived from anthropology not a particular urge to go deeper into it, but as a tool of intellectual liberation. And in that sense, all the talk about myths and rituals really, to me, were a recognition that in these primitive cultures, as they were called, they were functional mechanisms, often not just for solidarity and bonding, but when it comes to myths, they were also functions of concentrating power. And the idea that a discipline would talk systematically, openly, creatively, empirically about myths without regression analysis and without Mr. Parsons' abstractions of sociology really impressed me. And it told me that this is a way to tear the myths in our society, which are so destructive, because the function of myths in our society, and I'm not particularly talking about the artistic world, but the function of myths in our society is to control us. Because if the reality was bandied about without the myths, it would produce resistance. It would produce change. And so the myths were ways of explaining a pattern of society and nationhood that simply was overwhelmingly fictional. And the automobile battle was a perfect example of that. The myth was that all deaths were due to the nut behind the wheel, the driver, and there was never any discussion of the highway or the vehicle or the secondary collision or crashworthiness, even if there was a drunk driver crashing into you. And I remember going to these symposiums on traffic safety again and again, where very bright technical minds would assemble, and it never occurred to anyone during the coffee break that they never talked about the vehicle, its design, its construction, its braking, its handling, its crashworthiness. And they never talked much about the highway. Because if they did, the responsibility laser would go right to Detroit and to General Motors. So there is this very adroit language of evasion that operated, a language of avoidance that operated. And you will see it at all the meetings you attend, other than your beer partners. You will see faculty meetings where there is a language of avoidance, they don't face up to it, and increasingly, especially in an era of specialization, they begin to back up. So if they're talking about some human need, they back up, they back up, they back up into more and more micro-specialization with symbolic representations and abstraction ladders until they've created a lot of careers for themselves, but a lot of escape from focusing on the empirical reality. And there was once a time when a society basically asked itself three questions. How do we get food? How do we get clothing from the elements? And how do we get shelter? And now you can see how, when we ask those same questions, how meetings back up and keep avoiding the issue. And I pay great tribute to anthropology for that kind of liberation, because they wallow in myth exposure and documentation. I mean, that's part of their being and rationale. Now, what if we just start with a simple assumption here? And the sociologist Lind put it in the title of his book, and as far as I know, that was the whole worth of the book. You didn't have to read it. It was called Knowledge for What? And why do we want to accumulate knowledge? Because presumably we want a better society and a better world, and we want to allow conditions and systems and opportunities and freedoms to fulfill human possibilities. And there are other reasons for accumulating knowledge, and I think Adlai Stevenson adroitly spun Thorstein Veblen around, and he called it the leisure of the theory class. And it's knowledge for knowledge's sake, and it's a gratifying way to live. Certainly beats text messaging and other things like that. And so once we start with that, then the question is, how do we face up to empirical reality? And if we want to develop theoretical constructs, fine. But if they're not rooted, as Hugo has said, in empirical reality, it becomes a form, innocently, a form of dilettantism, or a form of sycophancy, or a form of surrender to the structure of concentrated power. And so, I want to just give a couple examples, because this is about Laura Nader's work here, and sometimes instead of just listing certain traits that drive inquiries against the conventional paradigms and the self-serving promotional assumptions of a learned discipline, it's good just to give three quick examples. Isaac Newton was once asked at a gathering, "Mr. Newton, why are you so much more brilliant than your peers?" And Newton answered this way. He said, "I am not so much more brilliant than my peers. I just can hold a problem in my mind and concentrate on it longer than most of them." The word is concentration. The second example comes from Einstein, who in a classic understatement said, quote, "I have no special gifts. I only have a passionate curiosity." So the word is curiosity. And then the third one was from William Blake, who at a party many, many generations ago was asked by a friend, "Mr. Blake, with whom are you living these days?" And Blake responded, "With whom I am living? I am living with my imagination." So you have concentration, curiosity, and imagination. That's what anthropology does at its best. Laura spent time living in the Zapotec country of Mexico, mountains of Mexico, and in the Libya village in Lebanon. And that's concentration. That's not pontification. That's not armchair cogitation, which has its role. That's concentration. And curiosity and imagination, they are extremely productive of getting the best out of your mind. Getting the best out of your mind in order to pursue a purposeful course of knowledge. My sister Laura Nader has the same trait, and she's here tonight. She was one of the pioneers of what was euphemistically called science in public policy. But what it really was, an attempt to take big science and put it in the exact context that it was operating in, which is power politics. And what determined what science was going to be produced, or heralded, or networked with government or business, had very little to do with the pure scientific method. Science and technology as tools reflected something very important. It reflected the inequitable power structure that commandeered it. And we can see that today in nanotechnology. We can see that today in biotechnology. And when Claire was chairing the Council on Responsible Genetics at Cambridge, it was started by MIT and Harvard scientists. The key problem was that this transforming technology, changing the nature of nature, was proceeding year after year without any legal or ethical framework whatsoever. And the same is true for nanotechnology. And that led to an important distinction, which is the difference between corporate science and academic science. And corporate science is running roughshod over the academy's academic science. And the two are quite different. Academic science is open, it's non-proprietary, it's peer-reviewed, And with some exceptions, it's not known for its political power in Washington. Corporate science is not very often peer-reviewed, especially in its inception and deployment. It is proprietary and secret. It has commercial motivations that shape its suppression or its application, and it's very powerful in Washington, D.C. Try Monsanto, single-handedly blocking the labeling of genetically engineered crops. Now, this is all by way of saying the choice of study by anthropology is not a choice that often comes from a sense of urgency about alleviating the pain and the injustice and the suppression of the mass of humanity. Just think, last year we had the highest level of tuberculosis victims in history. Keeps getting worse. And yet, we eradicated tuberculosis in the late 1950s and early 60s in the US. So the connection between knowledge and diffusion of its benefits is still very raw. And you and I could give all kinds of other examples. Contaminated drinking water, and many other things that are leading to millions of lost lives. And so, once we tear apart these censorious conventions, we see a whole world out there that anthropology could make a huge contribution to. Why is it that bureaucracies are so tyrannically successful in blocking the most rational courses of action? Whether it's just energy policy, health insurance policy. We know how to educate children, but there are interferences. Bureaucracy is the bane of mankind. The mayor of Moscow, the mayor of New York, the mayor of Accra, the mayor of Bogota, they all have things in common. All they need is a translation. We have here tonight Governor Jerry Brown, whose ability to change the state is constantly blocked by bureaucracy and corporate interests. And why aren't these studied vigorously, bottom up, by anthropologists? And so in this meeting with Margaret Mead, I basically said that anthropology became the most exciting social science discipline in the 50s at Princeton because, number one, it came out of World War II as solving some problems. Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Ruth Benedict, and others. And it also was very descriptive. It wasn't abstract. It was very real in terms of ethnography. People were there observing. And third, it was exciting because it told us that there are other ways of doing things. And that we didn't have a monopoly on how to deal with common problems that transcend cultures. Survival problems and health problems and all the rest of it. And in that sense, it tends to temper our arrogance and our ethnocentrism, which is now called exceptionalism. And so, in this exchange with Margaret Mead, and I want to be faithful to her response, which is really very critical, but in her kind way. Because she's not here to respond. I want to be very fair, and the transcripts are in the Anthropology Society of Washington, D.C. Anybody who wants to go through. Although my sir response somehow didn't get in there. But it was, I took the assumption of merciless self-examination, which anthropology at its best engages in. Merciless self-examination. And I started out by saying that we had 2 anthropology students from Berkeley, they were graduate students, join a number of law students to study the giant corporate law firm of Covington and Burley in Washington, D.C. in the early 70s. And it was one of the greatest culture shocks I've ever seen graduate students encounter. They couldn't adjust to being participant observers of this law firm. they felt they only had to be observers. That if they were participant observers, they would be asking prejudicial questions, like, at what point, partner at Covington Burling, do you separate your service to a corporation because you don't like what the corporation is doing? So you basically, I'm not going to represent you anymore. And this was a very difficult period of weeks in that summer. And they had to eventually, they just left. They couldn't handle the participant observer part of it. They thought the law students had a point of view and they were pursuing it. Well, it turned out the law firm refused all access, except what we could get at night with a few junior associates at their home. And they blocked us at every point. And in so doing, we were confronted with the puzzle. How do you study an institution? How do you do so an ethnography when it's completely hostile and it possesses the power to exclude you? Well, the anthropology graduate students didn't have an answer to that because they didn't want to take the adversarial inquiry approach that the law students took. This was eventually in a book, half of the book, called The Other Government by Mark Green, for those of you who are interested. The second example was about a year later, we launched the biggest investigation of Congress in American history. One by one, we produced magazine-size profiles, every member of Congress running for re-election in that year. And we had some anthropology students. My love for anthropology and what it's done for me has made me constantly overestimate the capacity of anthropology graduate students to deal with these problems. And they could not deal with qualitative scrutiny. They were always searching for data and how do you put the key cards in those days in the computer. And we'd say to them, the first stage was qualitative. You can't ask the right questions. You can't just say we want to have data. You got to know where you're going, what you're looking into. And inescapably, these were qualitative questions. So that didn't work out either. So then it was, and I'm summarizing this, it was Margaret Mead's time. And I had summarized these two examples by just basically going through that what anthropology covers from our point of view and what our mission was challenging assumptions of time, space, access, and available alternatives through comparative analysis. So her reply was like this, and it's quite interesting. First she said, Ralph, what are you doing taking on baby anthropologists to do this kind of work? She said, if you ask some seasoned anthropologist, or if you ask me, here's the problem, how can you help us? I would have done it immediately, she said. I've never regretted that since, of course. I mean, imagine asking Margaret Mead to help us like that. She would have done it immediately. But the second comment, she said, anthropologists study the whole. They don't study a partisan slice. They study the whole. And you're studying a slice. And she made the point that she went to South Africa. She not only studied the resistance, she studied the pro-apartheid establishment as well. And the third thing she said is, stop trying to make anthropologists you. That you people are crusaders. Horrible current term. You people are crusaders, and you should present problems and ask the anthropologists to contribute information about it. And she said, you've got to say, this is a job we want to do. How can you contribute to helping? And then she said something in agreement. She said that I was correct in saying that there was a lot of paralysis in departments of anthropology around the country, but that was due primarily, quote, to the lack of clients, end quote. As she put it, in applied anthropology, you worked for somebody. During the war, we had people ask us to do things. If you ever came to me, I would have provided you with my observations and experience. And it was a lack of clients. Now let's just go forward fast and say, who's hiring anthropologists these days? Corporations are hiring anthropologists for some of the most trivial product announcements you can imagine in terms of trying to market it better. And governments are hiring anthropologists. And the military-industrial complex is hiring anthropologists. But at the same time, there are anthropologists everywhere who are, in effect, they're investigating phenomena that have been resistant to inquiry. And a good many of them are in the department here. The whole ethical framework of biotechnology is being handled by one of your professors. The commodification of organ sales, human organ sales, by another one of your professors. So things are evolving in ways that are challenging a sort of rigid barrier of so-called objectivity. The issue is not objectivity. Nobody can come to a problem without value systems. The issue is accuracy. It's reality, and making clear what your value systems are. And so, in that way, a whole spectrum of realities in this country, in the world, will be open to inquiry. For example, institutionalized insanity. That is a very important subject. There are institutions that are behaving in ways that if an individual behaves, it would be called a serious problem of mental health suitable for commitment. Companies are behaving that way. Government agencies are behaving that way. Imagine, half of the federal government's operating budget is military, and we no longer have the Soviet Union. And the behavior of allocation of public budgets itself is an extremely important topic. Margaret Mead did show her hand, though, the activist she always was, when she said to me once on another occasion, Ralph, if you want to get more people to use seatbelts, focus on the children. Because the adults may not want to protect themselves by buckling up, but they sure want to protect the children. So how does that fit in with her response to me? How does that fit in terms of study? I don't know how it fits